You remember that? Happy memories. That was the last budget, the moment where Rachel Reeves came out and said, look, I've got all these taxes I want to raise, but that's kind of it. That's all the bad news. And from here on, it's kind of sunlit uplands, thereabouts. So how's it come to this? How's it come to the fact that we've got a budget coming up which could well be even worse in terms of tax raising than the last one? Well, let me show you what we're talking about here. And the key thing you've got to remember here is there's two things that are overshadowing everything when it comes to the UK economy and the fiscal situation right now. And the first of them is the fact that the economy isn't doing as well as a lot of people had hoped at this period. This is showing you productivity and how much has kind of gone up in recent years. That was 2008. At that point, it looked like maybe it was just going to carry on rising and rising and rising. Of course, we know what happened next. It didn't. It basically flatlined. And that's kind of where we are at the moment. And the gap between where we might have been and where we are now is 23%. We are, as a nation, 23% poorer. And that has a bearing on the public finances as well as all of our wallets, because we're all paying less in the way of tax because we're not as well off. And there's a bit of a hole in the public finances. And one of the things we're going to get from the Office of Budget Responsibility is a kind of a new assessment for what they think that line is going to do in the future. And it doesn't look like that's going to be brilliant for Rachel Reeves. The other factor overshadowing everything else is the fact that last time around, the Chancellor said she was going to do all of these things like improving the welfare state, cutting things like winter fuel allowance, all of that. And she hasn't been able to pull it off. And as a result of that, when you look at the spending in the coming years on everything like from the pension to universal credit to other forms of welfare, these bars are just going up and up and up. This is just into the future. So those two things together, extra spending on things like welfare and then less money coming in tax revenues, those overshadow everything else. And that kind of helps explain why this might be one of those kind of miserable budgets. And when I say miserable, here's one way of looking at it, OK? What this chart is showing you is in each budget, going back to 2010 and the period of George Osborne, how much extra splurging was done by the government and how much kind of cutting back, so squeezing was done. And the squeezing, sometimes it's through tax rises, sometimes it's through spending cuts. So, for instance, just to kind of go back a bit through history, George Osborne, austerity, all those spending cuts, that's why these bars are in the kind of pink bit there, underline. That's austerity there. And then, lo and behold, right, why is that up there? It's because there was an election in 2015 and George Osborne suddenly came out and says, oh, I think we'll actually spend lots of money. And then the election happened and then you're back to kind of what you might call austerity after it. Or, for instance, just more recently, COVID, big splurge, and then money came back. So extra taxes after COVID with national insurance going up, health and social care levy it was called. The mini-budget happened. And then, of course, Jeremy Hunt stepped in as Chancellor and said, no, we've got to raise taxes to try and pay for the mess that we have at the moment. So that's kind of, a bit of recent history. And there was the budget in 2024, that moment that Rachel Reeves stood outside of number 11. A lot of extra spending. So there were taxes that were levied there, but also quite a lot of extra spending on things like investments. That was the spring statement earlier this year. And the big question now is, where's this bar going to go? And based on what we've been hearing about, it sounds like there might well be something like £35 billion worth of measures, for which read mostly tax rises, that she's going to do. And if that's the case, that bar is what we're talking about. And it's worth just kind of taking a step back and looking at what this means. So if you ignore things like the post-mini-budget period or post-COVID, this actually would be one of the biggest squeezes that we've had since the George Osborne austerity period. Now, admittedly, done through tax rises rather than through spending cuts, but all the same, it gives you a sense of the gravity of what we're talking about, potentially. No one knows for sure what's going to be coming there, but that's kind of, 35 billion seems like a relatively conservative estimate of what they're talking about. But here's where we get to the kind of interesting detail. How is that actually going to be achieved? How do you raise £35 billion? Well, it seems like a big part of the answer for this government is going to be fiscal drag. Now, fiscal drag is a bit of a drag to explain, I'm afraid, but I've got to think, perhaps the best way of visualising it so you get a sense of actually why this is a really big deal. And it's known, some people call it a stealth tax. You'll see why it really is quite a big stealth tax. This is showing you, just in recent years, the median income in the UK before tax. So you can see it goes up and up and up to where it is at the moment, kind of over £30,000. And here is the personal allowance. Now, that's really important because that is the point at which you start paying income tax. So anything below that line, is untaxed income. You get to keep all of that bit. Anything above the line, well, that's your tax. So that's taxed income. And here's what's kind of critical here. Look at the fact that under the coalition, the red line was going up, wasn't it? You can see how it's going up. And so the kind of slug here, the amount between the two, the red-pink bit here, was actually getting a little bit smaller over time. You were getting to keep more of your money there. But then in recent years, that line has been frozen. So basically, kind of over the last kind of 5 years or so, that has been frozen, and that line has gone up. So people have been getting better off, and as they get better off, comparatively more of their money gets taxed. It's not, by the way, just the median household we're talking about. So even if you go up to the very wealthiest, so the top 1% of the population, they have been getting wealthier even more quickly than the median household, and they have been taxed on it as their earnings have gone up. And that's part of what explains the fact that actually an increasing amount of the total amount of tax paid in the UK is actually paid by the top 10%, 1%. It's down to the fact partly that they've got higher tax rates, but partly also that they're dragged into all of these different tax bands much more quickly than previously would have been the case. Anyway, back to this. Here's what's important about this budget. It seems basically nailed on that the Chancellor is going to extend that period of the freeze for another couple of years. And if that happens, look at those lines. So that, you know, one is making presumptions about earnings increasing, and then that staying like that. If that happens, then you've got this big slug of extra money that's taxed. And to put this kind of into perspective here, so in 2019, about 52% of the median household, about 52% of that income was being taxed. By the end of this period, it's 64%. So you see, without even raising the basic rate of income tax, the amount that we are paying in tax goes up as that pink slice gets bigger and bigger. That's fiscal drag, and that's what it looks like is going to be the main money raiser in this budget, at least based on what we're tending to hear. So if you take that over there, and we're asking the question here, how do you get to that £35 billion that Rachel Reeves thinks she might well need? Freezing allowances may well bring in about £8 billion. But you've got to do other stuff on top of that because you need to get up to that bar. So on top of that, we're hearing that there might well be a mansion tax. I mean, in practice, this is kind of extra council tax for people in the top two bands of council tax. It's not many households, but it could potentially raise a few £billion. Worth asking the question, though, by the way, you know, here in the UK, a lot of people have been wondering, you know, should we have more wealth taxes? And kind of property taxes are another form of wealth taxes. And actually, I looked through the comparison between the UK and other countries around the world. We don't have a wealth tax. So some other countries around the world do have wealth taxes. Look at Norway, Spain, Belgium. And here's how much they actually raise in those wealth taxes. When I say wealth taxes, it's kind of taxes on financial assets for the most part. But we do have property taxes in the UK, and that's mostly council tax and partly business rates. And when you kind of add council taxes and business rates, the UK actually is higher than basically anyone else in the developed world. And add on the other bits and pieces. So this is showing your total taxation as a percentage of all revenues on assets. And the UK actually has some of the highest taxation on property anywhere in the world. And that's the interesting thing. This mansion tax will potentially make that bar even higher than it was before. So that's kind of interesting. But what's also interesting, when we go back to where we were a second ago, so there's the mansion tax, there's freezing the allowance, is that question of how we're going to get to £35 billion. And the short answer, it looks like, is lots of other little itty-bitty things. So there might be changes to capital gains tax, there might be a gambling duty, and then there's still all of this other room that the Chancellor has to kind of fill in. And this is kind of the intriguing but also kind of unnerving thing. It does raise the possibility that this is going to be quite a complex budget with all sorts of little bits and pieces. And that gets to kind of the final thing I wanted to point out, which is that not that long ago, budgets were quite simple. This is showing you, these bars are showing you basically the number of different tax measures in budgets going back to the 1970s. And so back, 1975, that was the last time the basic rate of income tax was increased. You've got 2003, there was a big increase in national insurance under Gordon Brown. You've got the VAT increases that George Osborne introduced, and also Nix as well in 2010. But you'll see that the bars are quite low But look at what happened after then. So governments started to commit to not raising things like the basic rate of income tax. And look at what happens to these bars. All of a sudden, budgets start getting more complex. So you have to have more measures in there just to try and raise that money, because it's really hard to raise any money when you're not doing it through the big things like raising the basic rate of income tax. And as a result, the bars get higher, budgets get more complex, and you end up occasionally with things like, do you remember the omnishambles budget? That was the George Osborne one where the pasty tax happened, basically because they had so many little itty-bitty measures that some of them really didn't pass the sniff test. And I think that's going to be the interesting thing to look out for with this budget. How high is this bar in the budget going to be? Is it going to be kind of through the roof? And in turn, does that mean there are going to be kind of some grenades in there that might well explode in the future? But there's really, so much speculation about this, and we're going to have all sorts of analysis just kind of guiding you through what's going on there, and hopefully a lot of charts as well.